For those of you keeping score at home, we're now just past the halfway point of Lent. There are a few weeks to go, but more of it behind you than before you at this point. And I imagine for some of you this is a bit of a relief. For others of you who enjoy this self-reflective opportunity to focus on your sin and mortality, perhaps it brings some sadness. And for others of you, this may be a gentle reminder to finally get around to that Lenten discipline you thought about starting a few weeks ago. Let me assure you, there's still plenty of time. It has been a crazy couple of weeks, folks. Since you and I were together last, we've seen 2 nor'easters come through our area, leaving a wake of destruction, thousands without electricity, many of them here in this room today. We've seen rain, we've seen snow, and we've seen the fierceness of the wind, the likes of which we do not often see. And though I missed being with many of you last Sunday, I was immensely grateful to be in the company of 30 beautiful, powerful, resilient, prayerful, reflective, and joyful women at Princeton Theological Seminary for our annual women's retreat. It was not our plan to be at Princeton for the weekend, but the nor'easter had other plans for us. And so I would add flexible to the list of qualities that these women bore. The weather changed, so our plans did as well. And fortunately, the Spirit shows up just about anywhere we go, and we were able to enjoy a wonderful weekend together. This morning, I want to tell you a little bit about our retreat, because the focus for our weekend, last weekend together, was joy. Cultivating joy, naming joy, living into joy. In the early parts of our weekend, we took some time naming what we saw as ingredients for joy based on the biblical text we were exploring. In other words, what was it that made joy possible in these biblical moments? We asked hard questions about what joy looks like, how we can name it when we see it. Is joy synonymous with happiness? Is joy only joy if it surprises us? Do we have the capacity to create joy? Or is it the surprising nature of joy that actually has the capacity to be a part of our creation and our growth? How do we connect a life of joy with a life of faith? Or are they one in the same? Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. For his steadfast love endures forever. Let the redeemed of the Lord say so, those he redeemed from trouble and gathered in from the land. Some were sick through their sinful ways, and because of their iniquities endured affliction. And then they cried to the Lord in their trouble. And he saved them from their distress. He sent his word and healed them and delivered them from destruction. Let them thank the Lord for his wonderful works, and let them tell of his deeds with songs of joy. In some form or another, our entire psalm today seems to elicit joy. But it was that very last verse, those songs of joy, that took me back to our retreat together and really caught my attention. Tell of his deeds with songs of joy. Like many other psalms, Psalm 107 provides us an opportunity to praise and worship the God of creation, the God who has redeemed those who have cried out from the pit of despair, the God who has rescued humanity from despair and the death of sin. Let us give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, and let us tell of his deeds with songs of joy. This particular psalm was not a part of what we explored on our retreat, but we actually took some time to do just that, to tell of God's deeds with songs of joy. Over the course of our time together on this retreat, we were each asked to make joy timelines of our life. naming in each decade of our life the moments or experiences or people we can recall who have brought us great joy. There were many of us who included childhood memories of great joy. Later in life, many included a trip of a lifetime or an experience of a lifetime, a source of great joy. Many women named weddings or the birth of children, the typical stuff you might expect when someone mentions joy. The surprising thing, however, was how many of us, myself included, who had on our joy timeline a very painful experience or season of life. Perhaps it was a death or an illness or a period of deep grief or fear, but certainly something that might not come to mind when you first think of joy. And yet, together in conversation, we all began to realize, as we heard each other's stories and shared our own, we realized just how often our stories of great joy and great suffering are inextricably linked. As we shared these joy timelines with one another, looking back over our lives, obviously with hindsight being 20/20, we became aware that amidst many moments of suffering, we had also known the profound presence of the sacred. The profound presence of God in a way we had not been able to name before, a presence that created a hopefulness, perhaps even a joy in the midst of despair. It was a reminder to all of us that there is a depth to joy, a sacredness to joy that happiness doesn't quite capture. It's not that happiness and joy fall in completely different categories. I would say they're often first cousins of one another. But most of us, as we looked back on those difficult moments or experiences, on those joy timelines of our lives, we wouldn't have marked those seasons as happy times. They were often painful ones, and yet also times when there was joy. I once heard described happiness as an inch deep and a mile wide, but joy is a mile deep and an inch wide. The sacredness of joy, God's surprising interruption of joy. Sometimes it comes when we least expect it. And sometimes it's only looking back that we can see it at all. And it was the tension of that joy and the despair that drew me into the text of Psalm 107, because Psalm 107 is full of praise, full of these songs of joy, but it is also a psalm full of suffering and full of pain, full of despair down in the darkest pit of life. In our text today, we hear of people so sick that they drew near to the gates of death. And yet the psalmist calls even for those who have known the depths of despair to proclaim the good deeds of the Lord with songs of joy. For God has redeemed them from the pit and delivered them from destruction. Let them tell of his wonderful deeds with songs of joy. And that's where I got a little stuck. Stuck because it's a psalm that, like our joy timelines, seems to be written with hindsight 20/20. Of course they can sing songs of joy. God has redeemed them from the pit. Of course we can name joy in the midst of despair that happened 20 years ago. We're not living in that pit anymore. Of course they can sing of God's steadfast love. God has delivered them from destruction. Sing songs of joy. Tell of God's wonderful deeds. No problem. But what about those of us who know the darkness of that pit all too well? What about those of us who are living in that pit right now? What about those of us who don't feel any deliverance from the destruction that we are in? What about us? Is there any good news in this psalm for us? We learned from our retreat leader this past weekend that the Yale Center for Faith and Culture at Yale Divinity School, it is in the midst of an incredible study on joy, and they've only begun to scratch the surface of that exploration. One of the scholars and theologians who they've interviewed in the midst of this exploration of joy is the Anglican Bishop N.T. Wright. And Bishop Wright was interviewed about joy. And during that interview, he shared his experience of presiding over two very different funerals. One funeral was his father's. His father had lived to be 91. And though Wright says he was surprised how still incredibly painful that death was, he explained that alongside that pain, there was a feeling of completeness. There was a sense of thanking God for a life well lived and a joy in knowing that he was commending his father to God. At that funeral, he said, "I prayed with joy, tears streaming down my face, but with joy, thanking God for this life, celebrating that in the resurrection we too will share God's joy." There was a completeness. There was a joy. But the other funeral was far different. Bishop Wright shared a story from his campus ministry days as he walked alongside a graduate couple who had received their first child into the world. But within days of that child's birth, the child was diagnosed with a heart defect. And within days of this diagnosis, the child died. Wright described the incredible pain of that loss, how horrific it was to lead a congregation through that funeral and that grief. This couple found themselves surrounded by other young parents and friends and family, but all of them with the unanswerable question of why. Why in God's name has this happened? My God, why have you forsaken me? Wright went on to say in his interview that to give an easy answer at that point was only ever very bad news. Like a young mother who's diagnosed with cancer and is told, "It's okay, everything happens for a reason." Or when life gives you lemons, just make lemonade. Or God won't give you anything you can't handle. For a parent who has lost a child, for a young mother diagnosed with cancer, like Wright said, an easy answer in those moments is only ever very bad news. He went on to say that for this couple who had just lost their child, there was no, "It's all right because," this death, this ending, this snuffing out of life far too soon, like so many other tragic and horrific and painful parts of our humanity, it was a part of this groaning of creation, as Wright said. All we could do in that time was groan and weep and hope and pray that somehow God the Spirit was groaning within us and for us and would, through that groaning, bring God's new world to birth. The joy, Wright claims, in the midst of that pain was not going to be found in that moment, but was in the larger Christian narrative. Because to try to say in the middle of that funeral, well, I've got this hope inside of me, so it's not so bad, it would have been to deny what was actually tearing everyone apart. But as Christians, Wright proclaims, even amid suffering, there can be hope and there can be joy. Not necessarily at the time, not necessarily in itself, but Wright points out that when the Apostle Paul talks about suffering, he talks about being sorrowful yet always rejoicing, feeling as though he had received the sentence of death and so relying more fully on the God who raises the dead. Feeling as if he was being crushed to death, completely destroyed, and yet only with hindsight being able to claim the truth that here I still am. This, he says, is the nature of the narrative of the Christian life. That even amid sorrow there can be rejoicing. Even in the valley of the shadow of death, there is the promise of a God who raises the dead to new life. Again, it doesn't mean we can see it when it's happening. It doesn't mean we want anything to do with rejoicing when we're living in that pit. But as Christians, we believe that God is faithful still. And so sometimes we proclaim those songs of joy when our brothers and sisters sitting next to us cannot. The truth that God's love will conquer even death. And when we feel the depth of that promise, when perhaps only in hindsight we feel the sacredness of those holy moments on this earth, when God interrupts our lives in profound and surprising ways, perhaps we too have the capacity to sing even the faintest song of joy. For me, the most beautiful gift of Psalm 107 is a deep reminder of this greater gospel story. A reminder that God does hear the cries of all of us. A reminder that God's steadfast love is always with us, whether we have eyes to see it or not. It is a reminder that the story of the Christian life, this life of faith that sometimes we struggle so hard to believe and so hard to cling to. The truth is that there is always something for which we can sing songs of joy. Joy knowing that even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, there is something that I cling to that is more powerful and more extravagant than anything in this world. It is a joy that can never be taken from us because it doesn't lie with us and it's not dependent upon us. It lies only ever and always in the life and death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Sometimes there are moments so palpable, joy fills us so fully that we can proclaim with happiness and joy, we can proclaim it in every fiber of our being, saying, thank you, thank you, thank you, God. And sometimes joy can only be seen in hindsight, when we realize that amidst our help me, help me, help me's, we did not groan or weep alone. I think part of our task on this Lenten journey is to name joy when we see it, to sing songs of joy in the world as a reminder that our joy does not come from the world, but our joy comes from something far greater. It's so easy to look around the world today and name everything and everyone that is tearing it apart, but the fact of the matter is, the joy of the Lord is here. The joy of the Lord is present if only we have eyes to see it, ears to hear it, and a voice to sing about it and proclaim it. For God did save them from their distress. God delivered them from destruction. Let them thank the Lord for his steadfast love. And let them tell of God's deeds with songs of joy. Amen.